Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.
Welcome to the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly. I am Tim Eaton, President of the Chicago Bar Association. I'm very pleased to introduce State Representative Elaine Nekritz of Northbrook. Representative Nekritz is serving her 6th term in the Illinois House of Representatives and is a Democratic point person on the state's pension crisis. She is also a member of the Conference of Committee of 10, the House and Senate members tasked with addressing Illinois' worst in the nation unfunded pension liability. This year, she was named an Assistant Majority Leader in the House. Welcome to Justice, Law, and Weekly, Representative Nekritz.
Thank you so much.
Maybe we should first start off with just defining what is the pension crisis? What is the crisis about pensions in Illinois?
Illinois is not unique in having an issue with our pension systems, with the fact that they're not fully funded and that affects the ability of the systems to pay benefits in the future. Lots of states and lots of municipalities are facing these same problems. Ours is unique, however, in the enormity of the problem is that our underfunding is by far, as you said, the worst in the country, and that really does impact the sustainability of the systems and its affordability for taxpayers.
And what has been the effect of having this crisis? What will it mean to state government in its ability to address other issues?
We have $100 billion of unfunded liability, meaning that if we were in a place where the system were adequately funded, earning investments as it should be, that would be adequate to assure that the day everybody retired, as they retire, that we could fully pay their benefits. We're not in that situation right now. So the state is having to put a lot more money as the employer into the pension systems right now than we would otherwise under an adequately funded system. Over the last, just to give you a little short window on that, over the last 2 years, the pension payment has increased $1 billion a year. And when our total tax revenue into our general revenue fund is $35 billion, yes. That's a big number for us to absorb every year. So it has forced the General Assembly to make some very unpleasant decisions where we've had to cut funding for core services, education, health care, public safety. All those things have been dramatically impacted in not a positive way by the fact that the pension payment is increasing so rapidly.
So as I hear you, we have to get this resolved first before we can turn our attention to a lot of other issues that need to be addressed in terms of funding anyway.
In some ways, I would say that's true. I mean, I think that,
right.
that when the funding crisis really hit Illinois, back when the recession hit, I felt, my personal view was that we were going to have to raise revenues, we were going to have to make cuts, and we were going to have to make reforms. We've done some of the first two. The reforms to the pension system are really, I think, that critical third leg to getting our fiscal house in order.
Now, without pointing fingers, how did we get to this point? What's the cause of it?
There are a number of causes. The singular most largest cause is the fact that the General Assembly over decades, and I'm talking 50, 60 years, has failed to appropriate and to put a sufficient amount of money into the pension systems to make sure that they were earning the investments that we needed in order to pay those benefits. So the largest finger of blame, I think, goes to the General Assembly. But there are other, that constitutes about half of the underfunding. The other half comes from just misses when we didn't get the investment returns we thought. We didn't, right. The actuarial assumptions didn't, the mortality tables and so forth didn't quite come true. People are clearly living a lot longer than they were when these systems were being underfunded in the 80s and 90s. So those things have impacted the health of the pension systems as well.
And did our national recession exacerbate the situation?
It exacerbated the situation, again, not only for Illinois, but for every state. But even were we to be on a course of good economic health in Illinois and across the country, this is not the kind of thing where we can invest our way out of it. We are going to have to make some changes to the systems.
Now, I understand you are one of 10 legislators who've been asked to address the crisis and what we can do about it, 6 Democratic members and 4 Republicans. Why was this conference committee formed in the first place, and why is it bipartisan?
It's bipartisan because that's the rules under which the House and Senate operate in order to establish a conference committee. I've been in the legislature 12 years, and this is the first conference committee that I've seen. Generally, the leadership does not like to do them, but this is obviously a very significant issue, and we've been unable to resolve it between the House and the Senate, and so we needed something that would bring people together to talk about that. The House and the Senate both had their own proposals,
Yes.
very, very different proposals. And I think the dynamic at the end of the legislative session last May of 2013 was that that the House passed our version and looked at the Senate and said, well, of course the public pressure is going to force the Senate to act on our measure because our measure is the best. And the Senate passed their measure and then looked at the House and said, well, of course they're going to have to pass ours because ours is the best. And we were at a standoff. And the public pressure obviously didn't cause either chamber to behave differently. So the conference committee seems a reasonable way to try to reconcile those differences.
It seems interesting to me that there would be differences when you have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. I mean, I see that in the U.S. Congress where you have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. They have to have conferences to see if they can reach some agreement. Is it unusual to have members of the same party have these differences and have to have a conference committee?
I don't think it's all that unusual. I think that in some ways the depth of this difference is a little bit unique for this issue, and this issue is just so high profile that we see that that difference, and everyone always thinks that these things break down around partisan lines.
Right.
A lot of times they break down around regional lines, which is in a lot of ways what's happened on this pension issue as well. That there are very significant regional differences in how legislators want to address it.
And what would some of those regional differences mean? Do you mean between like suburban and Cook County or downstate and Chicago?
I would say it's mostly between downstate and the suburbs in Chicago.
Okay.
There are the pension systems and the state pension systems cover all the teachers, the downstate and suburban teachers, state employees, university employees, and then the judges and members of the General Assembly. Those are the 5 systems. There are not too many state facilities and the large public universities in Chicago in the suburbs. So when you're looking at the downstate members, they have a lot of prisons, developmental facilities, developmentally delayed facilities, mental health facilities, in addition to the major universities are all downstate. So those legislators have a lot more folks that are going to be impacted by these changes than someone like me from a suburban district. So that's a much tougher vote for them given their constituency.
Hasn't there been some issue with respect to the funding of teacher pensions, the state versus doing it in Chicago? As I understand, it's done by the county or the city?
The Chicago Teachers Pension Fund is funded by Chicago taxpayers through their property taxes.
Yes.
And so they're underfunded significantly because the same problems have arisen there where there's just not been enough money put in. But you are correct that the Chicago taxpayers not only pay for their salaries but also their pensions. Chicago taxpayers also pay through their income tax and sales taxes for downstate and suburban teacher pensions. And so there is that disparity there that hopefully at some point down the line we can get reconciled. I think that there's another policy reason that we would want the local districts and the universities to be paying for the pension costs of their employees. Again, these are people that never worked for the state, and should state taxpayers appropriately be bearing that burden? In a lot of ways, what's happened is because those school districts and universities don't have to take account for the full cost of the wages and benefits for their employees, that skews their incentives for when they're awarding salaries and benefits in a way that doesn't necessarily and has not necessarily favored state taxpayers. So we'd like to get those incentives aligned appropriately.
Now, that has been one issue where there's been a partisan divide.
There has been, yes, correct.
And the Republicans are resisting.
Not all the Republicans, but the majority. The majority, I would say, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think ultimately one of the solutions to the pension crisis may be to shift some of those pension responsibilities on the suburbs and the downstate communities?
I think ultimately we will do that. It will be a much more partisan roll call and a much more partisan vote than some of these other pension issues. But I think again, if we're going to get control of the spending that's going along with this, we have to make sure that those that are responsible for setting salaries also take into account the full cost of that when they set those salaries, and that is not happening right now.
Now, you mentioned before that we had a House proposal, Speaker Madigan's proposal, and President Cullerton's proposal. Can you just tell us essentially what were the major differences between the two, and either shortcomings or advantages of one versus the other?
Sure. Let me start with the Senate proposal. The Senate proposal had let me start with this. The basis for all of these, or the difficulties that we're having, is that the Illinois Constitution says that pension benefits shall not be diminished or impaired. Right. So our first hurdle is to say, how do we make this constitutional when we are looking at impacting benefits? And the Senate proposal took the view that that was a contractual right, which it is under the Constitution, and the only way to change that contract is to enter into a new contract. So we were offering employees a choice that they would have to make a selection between changing their benefits or keeping their benefits and losing access to healthcare, retiree health care. The House proposal basically used a police powers argument, saying that the state's in a crisis and the legislature has the ability to address that crisis in a way that they think is appropriate, and probably the least restrictive way they think is appropriate. But the legislatures still have that authority, and we were going to be exercising that authority. So those were two very different constitutional models. And the consequence of that was that the House proposal saved a lot more in terms of the pension payment that we were making versus the Senate proposal.
And
yes.
Approximately what was the difference in the amount that would be saved, House versus Senate?
The House proposal was scored by the pension systems themselves, and we were told that this would save $163 billion over 30 years. Right. The Senate proposal was in the $45 to $55 billion range on pension savings. Then there were additional health care savings because some folks would opt to keep their, to opt out of health care. But those were a little bit more difficult to anticipate what those savings would be.
Now, I know there have been some that have suggested that, at least on the Democratic side, there's some hesitancy to do anything with the pensions because of unions that are objecting to it. Has that been a pressure point for the Democrats in this discussion?
I would argue it's a pressure point for a lot of members of the General Assembly. Again, it sort of depends on the district, the kind of district that right. you represent and what your constituency is. But I can tell you that when the House passed the proposal that actually impacted retirees more than half of the Democratic caucus, House Democratic caucus, voted for that bill, and less than half of the House Republican caucus voted for that bill. So Democrats were the more responsible for passing that bill than House Republicans were. It was a little bit different dynamic in the Senate. There's more Senate Republicans actually voted when the House proposal went before the Senate. More Senate Republicans voted for it than did in the House.
I think you touched on this just a minute ago, but as a lawyer, I'm interested in the predictions that were being made by both President Cullerton and Speaker Madigan. Mm-hmm. Speaker Madigan believed that the House proposal would pass mm-hmm. constitutional muster, mm-hmm. and President Cullerton indicated that he was concerned about that and that he thought his bill would. I know no one is able to read tea leaves, but right. With respect to the House position, was that largely because of the police power focus on that as opposed to looking at just the contract provision?
Largely, and I think we also included some things in the House bill that I think we could have very legitimately argued were legal consideration for the changes we were making. We were going to be actually putting more money into the systems. Mm-hmm. We were offering a funding guarantee through that the pension systems could actually sue the state if we failed to pay. That's a right that does not now currently exist. Right. And we had some things in our legislation that we thought we could argue were consideration as well.
And I think I read a quote from you somewhere that although you didn't want to have to impose any cuts on anybody in terms of what they were making, both either pension or healthcare benefits, but at some point, I believe you said, if we don't, there may be nothing at all. And you didn't want that to happen.
Right, and I do believe that.
Is that a real risk?
It is a real risk. That you don't have to look any further than Detroit to know that those kinds of things can happen, and those, I don't know what those retirees will end up with, but the news media would indicate that it's maybe 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. That's a whole lot less than what we would be imposing from the state legislature on this. So I think it is a real risk, and that I forget which one. The bond. There was an article in the Bond Buyer just in the last couple days that for the teachers' retirement system, they were about 43% funded, 43% of the assets that they should have. In the last year, that's declined to 40%. So that's not the right direction, and that's despite, again, our pension payments going up significantly in the General Assembly, but it's still not enough. I do have real concern. It's not going to be in the next 5 years or the next 8 years, but 15, 20 years down the road, could this
so there's
system?
a possibility if we don't fix it.
Yes.
There may not be anything there to pay pensions.
Right.
So the Committee of 10, that's a big task. I mean, the enormous problems and enormous complexities. Where are you in how close do you think you are of reaching a solution?
That's the million-dollar question we get all the time.
Yeah.
We are very, very close to a resolution, and the conference committee has been, despite the fact that it's bipartisan and bicameral, the 10 of us have worked together very, very well, and much better than I might have anticipated when we first came into this in the middle of June. So I've been very pleased with how committed the members are to actually reaching a solution, and I think that reflects the commitment of our leadership in all 4 caucuses to also getting to solution. That being said, we've been very, very close for a number of weeks now, and we are having trouble getting over that final hurdle. And as so often happens in negotiations, the small things become big things, and no one's quite willing to give a little bit more to get to yes, and that's kind of where we are right now. But we're still talking. I believe in good faith, and I'm hopeful that we can get over those last hurdles, and everybody will say yes and hold hands and jump into the pool together.
Do you anticipate anything happening in the veto session?
I think it's still possible.
Days?
I think it's still possible that we could get something, and I know there are members of the leadership in the General Assembly that would really like to see that happen. So I take some hope from that.
Is one of the solutions, in addition to possibly looking at some cuts with respect to cost of living increases, for example, with respect to the pensions, and perhaps maybe the employees taking on more of the health care premium, perhaps. Do you see any tax increases coming out of this in order to make it work?
My goal is to avoid that. Right now, in the fiscal year we're in currently, that started on July 1, we're putting 22 cents of every tax dollar. So 22 cents of every tax dollar is going into the pension payment. That's anticipated. If we do nothing in the General Assembly, that will continue. That percentage of our general revenue will continue to go up. My goal is, throughout this whole discussion, has been to either flatten that or bring it down. What the conference committee has been proposing will basically flatten that and kind of hold it right, in the 20, 21, 22 cent range. It's still a big lift for the taxpayers, but at least it's not. At least we've changed the trajectory and stabilized the system. So I think if we can hold it where it is, that we will not need further tax increases in order to make these payments.
Do you think if there's no solution arrived at this fall, that after the beginning of if we do get into 2014, do you think there's going to be resistance the closer we get to an election, or maybe even a primary election for some of the representatives?
I think at this point, this issue has become so hot that I think most members are either exhausted by it or would like it behind them because they're tired of hearing about it. Right. And I think the public is tired of us dilly-dallying as well. So I think that pressure continues to be there. The other dynamic that I think will be significant is that the the increase in the income tax that was passed in January of
Yes.
2011 is due to expire at the end of 2014. So when we're at the end of calendar year 2014. So when we are negotiating next year's budget, January through May, I don't think that we will act on the extension of that tax increase next spring. We're going to be very constrained and ridiculously constrained in terms of that budget, and I think that having failed to do pension reform will not help the dynamic on that from and the public perception of how we are negotiating a budget. So I think it's all that really pushes us to get pension reform done sooner rather than later.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that there are other states that have had the same issue.
Sure.
We're not alone. What has been the solution or remedy in those states? Is there some sort of magic way to proceed? They made very tough decisions, obviously, but what had other states done to resolve this?
The state that looked most like Illinois in terms of the depth of the problem was Rhode Island. Much smaller state than ours, but their per capita debt for their pension system was very comparable to what ours is. So I think it is a good test case for us. They did something pretty similar to what we're proposing, and they did impact benefits for current employees in more significant ways than what we're proposing. And so, there's only so many levers to be pulled in order to make the kinds of changes that have to be made in order to stabilize the systems. Rhode Island found the way to do that, but theirs is being tested in court, even though they don't have the kind of state constitution protection against diminishment or impairment that we in Illinois have. They're being sued under the Contracts Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So it's impossible to avoid a lawsuit on these things.
Speaking of lawyers, do both sides have a group of lawyers, scholars, professors looking at the possible constitutional implications of what is going to be decided? And is your committee of 10? Are you involved with consulting legal experts on what might happen?
We've really been working with the lawyers on our respective staff.
I see.
But those lawyers have also been consulting with outside lawyers as well and having those discussions. This is something that's really never been tested before the Illinois Supreme Court. And if it had, I would argue even if it had, that the depth of the crisis we have right now makes this almost a unique situation. So we're all kind of doing the best we can to put together a bill that we think gives our lawyers the best case that they can present before the Supreme Court, and then we will see how it turns out.
This issue has been linked to a number of other issues, particularly by the governor, including your paycheck.
Yeah.
Has this held up any progress on more casinos, for example, in Illinois?
No.
Is there a link to that?
There's been a lot of rumor mill about those linkages, and I don't think at the end of the day that has impacted any of those other issues, with the exception of the governor vetoing our legislative pay, and that was definitely linked. Although the Supreme Court, said that he did not have the power to be able to do that, and so we're continuing to get paid.
Actually, I have other issues I know that are before the General Assembly, in addition to the pension issue, which is obviously the primary focus. Gay marriage is, I know, been debated, and I believe it passed the Senate.
It did pass the Senate last
the
spring,
House.
correct.
Do you see that as an issue that may be coming up again either in this session or perhaps in the new one after January?
I think it's very possible that it comes up in the veto session. The advocates behind that legislation have been very, very active this fall, especially in districts where legislators who are sort of on the fence are persuadable. And they've been doing a lot of groundwork, getting constituents to call those legislators, to contact them and say, please vote for this. So, and I know that the vote total, I think, is very, very close to having the requisite number of votes in the House.
That's certainly what I read.
Yes, so I think it's very possible that we could pass that.
So when you ran for the General Assembly 12 years ago, did you anticipate you'd be dealing with pension issues?
No, I did not. But, as things have developed, with it being, frankly, the most significant fiscal issue that the state faces, and it's been rewarding to have stepped into that. Frankly, I think there was kind of a leadership void there, and it's been rewarding to step into that and try to find solutions. And I've had a great partner in Senator Daniel Biss from Evanston as well. He's been a good sounding board.
Wonderful.
And as a math professor with a PhD in math from MIT, can't ask for a better guy to do numbers with.
Well, thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Let's hope we find the solution soon.
I hope so.
Representative Elaine Nekritz, thank you so much for informing us about the pension reform in Illinois and other important matters before the Illinois General Assembly. We hope your proposal is finalized soon. I'm Tim Eaton. Thank you for watching the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly.
Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.